Netheril, a name that echoes throughout the ages. It was once the most powerful and influential magical empire in the history of Faerun. Rising from humble beginnings as a collection of villages, Netheril grew to dominate not just the land, but the very fabric of magic itself. Its arcanists wielded unprecedented power, and its floating cities were wonders of the world. Yet, like all great empires, Netheril was doomed to fall, its glory consumed by hubris and the dangers of tampering with forces beyond their control. This is the story of Netheril, the rise and fall of a magical empire, the discovery of ancient lore, the forging of powerful alliances, and the eventual descent into shadows. From its founding to its diaspora, Netheril's legacy continues to shape the realms today, with its history offering lessons of both brilliance and caution. Let's journey back to the beginning, to the age when villages first banded together in defense, and a new era was born from the knowledge of the elves and the ambition of men. Chapter 1. The First Age. Long before the soaring cities and unimaginable magical feats that would come to define Netheril, the land was a patchwork of small, independent villages scattered across the northern plains. These villages were isolated, each struggling to survive in a harsh and unforgiving world. The landscape was dangerous, filled with raiders and monstrous threats lurking in the wilderness. But despite these challenges, the people of these villages were hardy and determined, eking out an existence against great odds. As the years passed, the villages grew tired of living in constant fear of attack. Orcish raiders from the spine of the world mountains would frequently sweep down, pillaging their meager resources, while goblins and bandits harassed them from the forests. Recognizing that survival was impossible in isolation, the villages began to form alliances for mutual protection. The most significant of these alliances was Seventon, named after the 7 largest settlements that took the lead in coordinating this mutual defense. This cooperative effort marked a turning point in the history of the region. For the first time, these independent communities began to see themselves as part of a larger whole, united by the need to protect one another. Over time, the bonds of necessity grew into the early seeds of what would become a unified culture. However, while they might have been protected themselves from the threats of the raiders and the marauding monsters, the true transformation of these villages was yet to come, and it would come from a completely unexpected source: the elves. In negative 3830 DR, the first contact between the elves and the humans of the region was made. The elves had long lived in the forests and valleys of Faerun, hidden away from the eyes of most humans. These elder beings, steeped in ancient wisdom and magical knowledge, had little reason to concern themselves with human affairs. However, over time, they began to notice the growing potential of these humans. Curious and cautious, they initiated trade with the villagers of Seventon, exchanging goods and resources. It was through these exchanges that the elves began to share more than just material. They began to share their knowledge of magic, or as they called it, the art. The humans who became the powerful Netherese started as workers for the elves, and the elves gave this little bit of magic to help them do this job, and that little bit of magic to help them do that job. The sharing of magic was a watershed moment in history. Before this, the concept of weaving magic into reality was almost entirely foreign to humans. The elves, who had mastered the manipulation of the weave, recognized the potential for humans to learn this skill as well. It was an act of generosity, and perhaps for some elves, a test of humanity's capacity to handle such power. The first human to successfully learn and harness this newfound knowledge was Faerun of Gurs, a humble scholar from one of the Seventon villages. He became the first human arcanist. a pioneer of magical study. Faerun's mastery of magic inspired awe amongst his people. Under his tutelage, others began to follow in his footsteps, and soon, magic spread throughout the village like wildfire. The ability to control the forces of magic marked the beginning of a dramatic shift in the balance of power in the region. The humans of Seventon, now more confident and ambitious, began to envision a future where they could rise beyond their humble beginnings. As with all great changes, this newfound power came with consequences. While the elves had hoped that sharing magic would lead to greater cooperation between their people and the humans, the opposite began to occur. As the humans of Seventon grew stronger through their mastery of magic, they became more assertive, expanding their influence and consolidating power. This power was not just used for defense. It became a tool of conquest and domination. The Rock Gnomes, a peaceful, industrious race that had lived in small enclaves near the Seventon villages for centuries. As the humans' magical abilities grew, they saw the gnomes as not allies, but as a resource to be exploited. Using their newfound arcane abilities, the Netherese began to enslave the gnomes, forcing them into labor to help build their settlements and support their burgeoning magical society. The gnomes, powerless to resist the might of human magic, were subjugated, marking the first of many acts that would strain the moral fabric of Netheril. As the humans of Seventon expanded their influence and resources, they also faced external threats. The orcs, from the spine of the world, remained a persistent danger, raiding the villages and destroying whatever they could not take. In response to these raids, the humans called upon their elven allies, the elves of Illifarn and Airlon, powerful kingdoms in their own right. They came to the aid of the Seventon Alliance, driving back the orcish hordes in a series of brutal conflicts. The battles forged a strong, though increasingly uneasy, alliance between the humans and the elves. These early conflicts served as a crucible, tempering the humans of Netheril into a force that could no longer be ignored. The alliance with the elves, combined with the newfound mastery of magic, gave the humans the confidence to look beyond mere survival. For the first time, they could envision the creation of a grand civilization, one built on the foundations of magic and cooperation. Yet, even in these early days, the seeds of Netheril's eventual downfall were being sown. Until this time, elves were a mere myth, imaginary creatures sent by the gods to lend a hand and redirect arid humans to the correct path. Netheril bowed its head in awe to these messengers of the earth spirits and venerated them. It took several years for the elves to convince these scarcely civilized humans that they were mortals. Despite their successes, the humans of Netheril were beginning to exhibit the hubris that would later define their society. The enslavement of the rock gnomes was but one example of how the quest for power began to corrupt their ideals. While the elves had taught them magic in the hopes of fostering peace and prosperity, the humans had started to view magic as a tool of dominance, a way to elevate themselves above others. This arrogance would only grow as Netheril's power expanded, eventually leading them down a dangerous path. Chapter 2: The Nether Age. The Nether Age marked a critical turning point in the history of Netheril, as the young civilization transitioned from a fledgling collection of magical villages to a full-fledged empire built upon the boundless possibilities of magic. This era, named for the incredible discoveries that would shape Netheril's dominance, saw both the height of human ambition and the darker side of their growing power. The pivotal moment of this age occurred in negative 3533 DR with the discovery of the Nether Scrolls. These ancient tomes, found amongst the ruins of Arivandar, were not merely books of spells or arcane theory, they were the very essence of magical knowledge. The scrolls contained the fundamental principles of magic, secrets that even the most learned elven sages had not fully mastered. For the Arcanists of Netheril, this discovery opened doors to power and potential that had been previously unimaginable. The Nether Scrolls not only accelerated the Netherese mastery of magic, but it also altered the balance of power in the region forever. This set of 100 scrolls provided the Netherese with an incredible jump in spellcraft, unseen in the history of Toril. With this new knowledge, Netheril's ambitions grew. The Arcanists began experimenting with new types of spells and magical constructs, pushing the boundaries of what could be achieved through magic. The scrolls allowed them to create new forms of magic that were previously thought impossible, and the results were astonishing. But with each new spell and each new discovery, Netheril's thirst for power became insatiable. The scrolls gave them the ability to reshape reality itself, but this power came at a cost. While the Netherese Arcanists reveled in their newfound power, the elves began to grow concerned. The elves had lived through millennia and knew well the dangers of unchecked magic. Though they had initially shared their knowledge with the humans, the pace at which the Netherese were advancing now alarmed them. Worse still, the human practice of enslaving the rock gnomes had continued unabated, and the elves viewed this as a grave injustice. The tension between the elves and the humans, once united in mutual defense, had begun to fracture. The elves, particularly those of Illifarn and Erlan, took matters into their own hands. In secret, they began working to undermine Netheril's expansion, hoping to disrupt the Empire's power structure and free the enslaved rock gnomes. With human ambition, the power of Netheril had grown far too great. The Arcanists, empowered by the Nether Scrolls, began to view themselves as untouchable, seeing even the ancient elves as a challenge they could easily overcome. During this period, Netheril's reach expanded beyond its original borders. New alliances were forged with the dwarven kingdom of Delzone, a trade relationship that brought great wealth and resources into Netheril. The Arcanists traded for dwarven craftsmanship, acquiring precious metals, gems, and weapons. The dwarves, though hesitant to fully trust the human empire, saw the benefit of this relationship and were willing to look past Netheril's more troubling practices. This relationship would play a key role in the Empire's continued growth and security. As Netheril grew in power, it also became more aggressive in its dealings with other human settlements. One of the most infamous acts of this period was the destruction of Faerun, a neighboring kingdom that had once been an ally of Netheril. The Arcanists of Netheril coveted the magical knowledge held by the Faerun scholars and sought to seize it for themselves. In a brutal campaign, Netheril's forces crushed Faerun, slaughtering many of its people and forcibly extracting the knowledge of their spells from the minds of the survivors. The conquest of Faerun was a turning point, marking the moment when Netheril shifted from a society focused on exploration and discovery to one driven by conquest and domination. The absorption of Faerun's magical secrets only further fueled Netheril's hunger for power, and it became clear that no neighboring kingdoms were safe from their ambition. This event also served as a warning to other potential rivals. To oppose Netheril was to face utter annihilation. The importance placed on magic helped bring Netheril to the top of Toril's magical nations. Despite the violence and growing ruthlessness of Netheril's Arcanists, This period also saw some of the most remarkable achievements in magical study. The study of the Nether Scrolls allowed for the development of new spells and enchanted items, many of which would become the foundation for Netheril's dominance. The Arcanists developed ways to manipulate the weave of magic in ways previously thought impossible, and the scope of their magical prowess expanded rapidly. The discovery of the scrolls and the advancements that followed transformed Netheril from a small, isolated kingdom into a vast empire, feared and respected by all who knew of its power. Yet this rapid expansion led to arrogance. The Arcanists believed themselves to be invincible, with power to control the very forces of the universe. However, as their power grew, so did the opposition they faced, not only from external forces, but from within their own ranks. The Trail of Mists, a secret network designed to help the enslaved gnomes escape Netherese oppression, was one of the most direct forms of internal resistance. Though the Arcanists held near absolute power, there were still those within Netheril who saw the injustice of their actions and sought to undermine the system from within. While the Trail of Mist helped many gnomes escape to freedom, it was a dangerous operation, with those caught aiding the gnomes facing severe punishment. Despite these tensions, the Arcanists of Netheril continued their relentless pursuit of power. Their research led to the creation of even more powerful spells, and their influence spread far beyond their borders. Even as they grew, the seeds of dissent and rebellion were being sown. The elves, furious at Netheril's treatment of the gnomes and their reckless use of magic, began to plot against them more openly, though the true confrontation between the two powers was still many years away. The Nether Age was a time of unparalleled growth and discovery for Netheril, but it was also a time of growing darkness. The Arcanists, now fully consumed by their desire for power, had set themselves on a path that would ultimately lead to both great achievements and devastating consequences. As their empire expanded and their knowledge of magic deepened, they began to lose sight of the very principles that had guided them in the beginning. What had once been a society of scholars and explorers was transforming into something far more dangerous, a magical empire that saw itself destined to rule over all. Chapter 3. The Mythal Era. The Mythal Era marked the zenith of Nethere's power and influence, a period of incredible magical innovation and expansion. This era, spanning from approximately -2954 DR, was defined by the creation of the Mythalar, a magical device of unprecedented power and utility. With the development of the Mythalar, Netheril transitioned from a society that practiced magic to one that was entirely built around it. Every aspect of life, from the economy to warfare, from transportation to architecture, became infused with arcane power, propelling Netheril to unimaginable heights. The birth of this era coincided with the arrival of one of Netheril's greatest figures, Lulam. Born to a modest family in -3095 DR, Lulam's genius quickly became apparent as he rose through the ranks of the Arcanists. By the time he was an adult, his magical prowess had already surpassed that of his peers. But it was not just his power that set him apart, it was his vision. Lulam dreamed of a society where magic was not just a tool wielded by a few, but the very foundation upon which civilization could be built. Lulam's first great achievement was the invention of the Mythalar in -3014 DR. The Mythalar was a massive globe-like magical device that could generate immense amounts of magical energy and distribute it over a wide area. What made the Mythalar revolutionary was its ability to power enchanted items and spells on a scale never seen before. It provided a stable source of magical energy that did not rely on the constant concentration or effort of a single caster. For the first time in history, magic could be harnessed like a natural resource, used to power cities, move armies, and manipulate the environment itself. With the creation of the Mythal Era, Lulam laid the foundation for Netheril's floating cities, or Enclaves. The most famous and awe-inspiring of all Netherese achievements. The first of these Enclaves was Zinlanal, raised into the sky in negative 2954 DR. Suspended by the power of the Mythal Era, Zinlanal was a marvel of magical engineering, and a prototype for dozens of floating cities that would follow. These cities, far removed from the concerns of the ground dwellers below, became the seat of power for the most influential and skilled arcanists, who lived in luxury while overseeing the vast lands beneath them. It allowed the Netherese arcanists to create magical items without the need of a permanency spell, and provided the constant magical force that allowed entire mountains to hover in the air. The creation of the floating cities gave rise to a division between High Netheril, the floating enclaves, and Low Netheril, the communities that remained on the ground. The citizens of High Netheril were the magical elite, living in splendor and comfort far above the reach of normal folk. Meanwhile, the people of Low Netheril, who lacked access to the Mythal Era's vast magical resource, were seen as lesser, fit only for labor and menial tasks. This division between the magical and non-magical classes would have far-reaching consequences in the centuries to come. Despite these internal divisions, Netheril continued to expand during the Mythal Era. Lulam, now recognized as the greatest arcanist of his time, led the Netherese in a series of campaigns to secure the lands surrounding their empire. One of the most significant of these campaigns was a war against the orc hordes that had long plagued the southern regions near the Plain of Standing Stones. In negative 3012 DR, Lulam personally led the Netherese forces in a decisive battle, using his unparalleled magical might to decimate the orcish armies. The extermination of the orcs in the region allowed Netheril to expand its influence unchecked, clearing the way for new settlements and more floating enclaves. Over 140,000 orcs were slaughtered, their bodies reddening the snow of two mountains that became known as Bone Hill and Thunder Peak. The extermination of the orcish threat was seen as a great victory, but it also reflected a growing ruthlessness in Netherese foreign policy. The arcanists became increasingly willing to use their magic not just to defend their borders, but to conquer and subjugate those they saw as inferior. This was most clearly demonstrated by the continued enslavement of the rock gnomes, who remained in chains despite ongoing efforts by the elves to liberate them. The Trail of Mists, a secret network established by elven sympathizers to help gnomes escape from Netherese oppression, continued to operate during this period, but its efforts were met with fierce resistance from the Netherese ruling class. Even as these tensions simmered, Netheril's magical advancements continued at an unprecedented pace. Lulam, ever the innovator, began creating the first Mythal Era-powered magic items. These items, which drew power directly from the Mythal Era, were capable of sustaining incredibly powerful magical enchantments indefinitely, without the need for a caster to constantly maintain them. Such items became commonplace in High Netheril, where everything, from transportation to architecture, was imbued with magical energy. With each new discovery, the gap between High and Low Netheril widened. The floating enclaves became centers of art, culture, and magical innovation, while the lands below provided the food, labor, and resources necessary to sustain the luxurious lifestyles of the arcanists. The people of Low Netheril, increasingly marginalized and impoverished, began to grow discontent with their lot, but their grievances were largely ignored by the ruling elite. The floating cities, removed as they were from the realities of life on the ground, seemed invulnerable to the problems that plagued the common folk. Yet despite these growing tensions, the Mythal Era was a time of extraordinary achievement. Netheril's floating cities were a marvel of the world, attracting scholars, traders, and adventurers from distant lands. Magical research flourished, and the arcanists of Netheril pushed the boundaries of what was possible with magic. New spells were created at a staggering rate, and magical constructs and golems became commonplace in the floating cities. For many, it seemed that Netheril's glory would last forever. Under Lulam's guidance, the Empire had transformed into a beacon of magical innovation, a land where anything seemed possible. The floating cities were symbols of human triumph over the natural world, and the Mythalar had unlocked possibilities that had been the stuff of dreams. But as with all great powers, Netheril's success carried with it the seeds of its own downfall. The very magic that had elevated the Empire to greatness would one day bring about its ruin. For now, though, such concerns were far from the minds of the Netherese arcanists. Netheril's future seemed as bright as the floating cities themselves, and Lulam, the master arcanist, continued to push the boundaries of what magic could achieve. Chapter 4: The Silver Age. The Silver Age of Netheril was a period of stabilization, reflection, and political evolution. While the Mythal Era had brought about unparalleled magical advancement and expansion, it also introduced internal tensions and an increasingly dangerous reliance on arcane power. As Netheril settled into its newfound power, the Empire began to face challenges that could not be solved with magic alone. In this era, the governance of Netheril evolved to match the complexity of its society. The magical elite who ruled the floating enclaves, known as High Netheril, were forced to develop new systems of government to address the growing needs of their civilization. In negative 2943 DR, the formation of the High Mages of Netheril, a council of the most powerful and influential arcanists, marked a turning point in how Netheril was governed. This council became the ruling body of Netheril, responsible for making decisions that affected the entire empire. In the year negative 1963, Netheril bore witness to an internal menace. Citizens who had little aptitude or respect for magic. The establishment of the High Mages brought a level of order and collaboration to Netherese society. These mages were no longer individual wizards pursuing personal power, but rather a collective that sought to guide the Empire. Though they wielded incredible magical abilities, they also recognized that such power had to be tempered with wisdom. The High Mages, drawn from both High and Low Netheril, worked to balance the needs of the magical elite with those of common folk, ensuring that the Empire could maintain its dominance while avoiding civil unrest. The challenges that Netheril faced were not only internal. The theft of several nether scrolls by an unknown thief in negative 2847 DR sent shockwaves through the magical community. The scrolls, which had been the foundation of Netheril's magical power, had been kept in highly guarded locations, and their sudden disappearance raised concerns about the security of the Empire. The scrolls were reportedly returned to the ancient ruins of Iqua Tel Qasir, a mysterious location steeped in elven lore. This incident reignited tensions between the elves and the Netherese, with many in Netheril accusing the elves of plotting against their empire. At the same time, the dilemma of gnome slavery began to weigh heavily on the minds of some of Netheril's rulers. The rock gnomes, who had been enslaved by the Netherese for centuries, continued to labor under harsh conditions. While the practice of gnome slavery had once been seen as a necessity for the expansion of the empire, the increasing influence of the High Mages brought about a shift in perspective. The council recognized that the continued subjugation of the gnomes would not only tarnish Netheril's reputation, but could also lead to further conflict with their elven allies. In negative 2845 DR, after years of debate and growing pressure from both external forces and internal reformers, the High Mages decreed that all gnome slaves were to be freed. While the decision was a moral victory, it also revealed deep fractures within Netheril's society. The reliance on slave labor had propped up many of the agricultural and industrial sections of Low Netheril, and the sudden emancipation of the gnomes left many communities scrambling to adjust. Netherese commoners and less powerful arcanists who were not yet capable of creating Mythal continued to dwell in the cities and keeps on the ground. As Netheril moved forward, the lessons of the Silver Age became ingrained in its collective consciousness. The mistakes of the past continued to haunt the Empire, even as its arcanists reached for the stars. Yet for all their wisdom and magical prowess, the arcanists of Netheril remained blind to the greater dangers lurking just beyond their grasp. Chapter 5: The Golden Age. The Golden Age of Netheril, spanning from negative 2103 DR to negative 1382 DR, was a time when the Empire reached the absolute height of its magical prowess and territorial influence. The floating enclaves of High Netheril soared above Faerun as beacons of human achievement, while its arcanists, now masters of the arcane, pushed the boundaries of magical discovery even further. It was an era of vast conquests, bold exploration, and remarkable feats of magic. This era began with a tragic event. In negative 2103 DR, a vast orc horde from the spine of the world attacked the northern city of Elusk, a human settlement fortified by Netherese arcanists. Elusk had long stood as a buffer against the monstrous threats of the north, but despite the valiant efforts of the Chronomancer, one of Netheril's greatest time-manipulating wizards, the city fell to the orcs. The loss of Elusk was a bitter blow, revealing that even with all their magic, the Netherese were not invincible. Yet, rather than dampen their ambition, this defeat spurred the Netherese onto greater heights. In the aftermath of Elusk's fall, Netheril turned its gaze outward, not just across Faerun, but to the world beneath and beyond. The dwarves of Delzoun, always a key ally and trading partner, founded the city of rubies, Zindelspar. In negative 1715 DR, built with the help of Netherese expatriates, the city flourished, becoming a shining example of Netherese dwarven cooperation. The establishment of such cities reflected a growing trend amongst the Netherese elite. While the floating enclaves were still the center of power, some of Netheril's most daring mages began seeking new frontiers beyond their borders, expanding their influence across Faerun and the Inner Sea. It was during this time, in 1770 DR, that the Netherese began to explore the depths of the Inner Sea. Driven by curiosity and a desire to expand their magical knowledge, they established 3 crystal dome subsea colonies on the continental shelf of the land that would eventually become Sembia. These colonies, Coolmath, Wirapan, and Ulavis, collectively known as Deep Netheril. These feats of magical engineering, protected by powerful enchantments and sustained by the Mythal technology that had made the floating cities possible. The exploration of the Inner Sea demonstrated that Netheril's ambitions knew no bounds. In these crystal dome cities, Netheril experimented with water-based magic, studied the sea life, and sought to uncover ancient, submerged ruins. With these ventures came the darker side of Netheril. The Cerosians, a race of Lokata who wandered near the Netherese holdings, were enslaved by the Arcanists of deep Netheril. For the Cerosians, this was a catastrophic development, and their plight did not go unnoticed by the ancient elven kingdoms under the sea. The High Mages of Selmalir, an elven kingdom that had long ruled the waters of the Inner Sea, were incensed by Netheril's actions. They saw the Netherese as reckless and dangerous, willing to subjugate anyone in their quest for magical power. In negative 1660 DR, Selmalir's High Mages unleashed a devastating counterstrike. Using powerful magics, they transformed the very crystal domes that protected deep Netheril into a substance that burned upon contact with water. The subsequent explosions obliterated the colonies, killing thousands of Netherese settlers and creating the Sirloon Bay and the Selgant Bay, reshaping the coastline forever. While the loss of these colonies were a severe blow to Netheril's expansionist ambitions, it did little to temper their relentless drive to master the world through magic. The Empire continued to push its boundaries, with explorers and Arcanists venturing into the farthest reaches of Faerun and beyond. The Golden Age also saw the proliferation of floating enclaves, with many new ones being constructed. These enclaves became not only centers of power, but symbols of Netherese dominance. Each enclave was a marvel of arcane engineering, built to house thousands of mages, scholars, and artisans who lived lives of unimaginable luxury. The expansion of the Empire also brought Netheril into conflict with other powers. In negative 1427 DR, the flourishing city of rubies, Zindelspar, was invaded by the Kalashite warlord Namalik Nadim, who led an army of monsters from Kalimshan. Despite the city's strong defenses and the magical prowess of its Arcanist inhabitants, Zindelspar fell within 10 days. The loss of such a valuable city marked another significant setback for Netheril's influence in the south. He very well could have taken healing and curative spells to fix his ailment, but, like all of Netheril archwizards, he believed the gods were merely archwizards like himself, who had found ultimate magic. Their pride wouldn't allow them to put their faith in the deities, for fear, if they put their trust in these advanced archwizards, they would never achieve ultimate magic themselves. Amidst these triumphs and losses, tensions simmered within Netheril itself. The reliance on magic had, over time, created deep divisions within society. The floating cities of High Netheril, where the magic elite resided, became increasingly disconnected from the common folk living on the ground below, in Low Netheril. The Arcanists, isolated in their enclaves, became more and more detached from the concerns of the common people, leading to resentment and unrest in the lower regions of the Empire. Chapter 6. The Enclaves of Netheril. During the height of Netheril, the Empire achieved unparalleled mastery over magic, culminating in the construction of the legendary floating enclaves. These massive, self-contained cities floated high above the world, powered by arcane devices called Mythal. Each enabled them to defy gravity and support a complex magical society. Each enclave had its own unique culture, leadership, and magical innovations, serving as both homes and centers of research for Netheril's greatest arcanists. In this chapter, we will explore 5 notable enclaves: Selunara, Thultanthar, Ailenar, Zinlanel, and their histories. Selunara, also known as Opus, was one of the most unique of Netheril's enclaves. Unlike many other floating cities, which focused primarily on arcane pursuits, Selunara was a center of devotion to the goddess Selûne and her teachings. The enclave's blend of divine and arcane magic made it stand out, and its residents were known as protectors of the balance between light and shadow. The Arcanists of Selunara placed great emphasis on maintaining harmony between the natural world, magic, and the divine forces. While many Netherese enclaves were driven by a relentless pursuit of power, Selunara's leaders sought a more harmonious path, fostering a blend of arcane and divine magic. This spiritual aspect attracted clerics and mystics, and the enclave became a place where both magic and religion flourished side by side. Thultanthar, often referred to as the City of Shade, was one of the most powerful and secretive enclaves in Netheril. Founded later in the Empire's history, Thultanthar became synonymous with its mastery of shadow magic, and its leader, Telemont Tanthul, a powerful arcanist who ruled with his 12 sons, known as the Princes of Shade. While most enclaves focused on traditional magic powered by the weave, Thultanthar's arcanists delved deeply into shadow magic, an arcane tradition that drew on the power of the shadow plane. This gave the city and its residents unparalleled control over illusions, darkness, and shadowy energies, allowing them to perform feats of magic that other enclaves could not. Eilinar was one of Netheril's most prestigious enclaves. Known for its focus on cutting-edge magical research, it was ruled by Karsus, a prodigy amongst Netherese arcanists, and the creator of many advanced magical innovations. Eilinar was considered a hub of magical progress, and its residents were some of the most powerful mages in the Empire. Eilinar was renowned for its groundbreaking magical research. Arcanists from across Netheril traveled to Eilinar to study with Karsus and his followers, seeking to master advanced forms of magic. The city became synonymous with heavy magic, a raw and potent form of arcane power that Karsus developed. Eilinar was also known for its vast libraries, where scrolls and tomes detailing the secrets of the weave were kept. It was home to some of the most sophisticated magical academies in Netheril, and its mages were often at the forefront of the Empire's most daring and experimental projects. Zinlanal holds a special place in the history of Netheril as the first floating enclave ever created. It was the brainchild of Lulam, one of Netheril's most legendary arcanists, and became the prototype for all other enclaves that followed. As the earliest example of Netherese mastery over the weave, Zinlanal was a beacon of Netheril's magical ingenuity and ambition. In -2954 DR, Lulam successfully created the first Mythalar-powered floating city, which became known as Zinlanal. This breakthrough changed the course of Netheril's history, allowing the Empire to both expand upward and outward, beyond the constraints of the natural world. Zinlanal was also where the first Mythalar-powered magic items were created. These items, powered by the city's central Mythalar, were capable of incredible feats, from allowing objects to float and fly, to providing near limitless magical energy for spells and enchantments. This success of these innovations spurred the creation of many more enclaves in the centuries to follow. The floating enclaves of Netheril were more than just cities. They were symbols of the Empire's mastery over magic, and the limitless potential that the Netherese believed they could harness. Each enclave had its own character. From the balanced, divine focus of Selunara to the shadowy intrigue of Thultanthar, the groundbreaking innovation of Zinlanal, these enclaves stood as pinnacles of magical achievement. Their histories intertwined with the evolution of arcane power in the world of Faerun. Their legacies, both in magic and in lore, continue to captivate scholars and adventurers alike. Chapter 7: The Age of Discovery. The Age of Discovery was a time of bold experimentation, as Netheril reached even further beyond its borders, seeking to unravel the deepest mysteries of the multiverse. After centuries of magical supremacy, Netherese arcanists grew restless, driven by their insatiable curiosity and ambition to push the boundaries of reality itself. This period, which spanned from negative 1114 DR to 800 DR, was characterized by exploration into other worlds, planar research, and dangerous experiments that would ultimately yield both incredible discoveries and dire consequences. By negative 1114 DR, Netherese society had reached a peak of magical and scientific understanding within their world. Their curiosity turned outward, towards the planes beyond Faerun. The idea of traveling to other worlds, something that had been touched upon during the Golden Age, became a central focus of Netherese experimentation. Arcanists devised complex rituals and spells that allowed them to reach into the far realms, the abyss, and other planes, hoping to unlock untapped sources of power and new forms of magic. These early experiments were fraught with peril. Many who ventured into these otherworldly dimensions never returned, consumed by the strange and incomprehensible forces that resided there. Despite these dangers, the Netherese remained undeterred, believing that the risks were worth the potential rewards. The High Netherese, in particular, saw planar exploration as their next great conquest, and many of the floating enclaves turned their resources towards that goal. In negative 1064 DR, Netheril made the first contact with one of the most terrifying entities in the multiverse, the Illithids, or Mind Flayers. The Illithids, a race of powerful psionic creatures with a mastery over mental domination, represented a dark and malevolent force within the universe. The Netherese were fascinated by their abilities, seeing in the Mind Flayers both a threat and a potential avenue of knowledge. For a time, the two civilizations engaged in precarious exchange of information, though neither trusted the other. The Illithids, who sought to subjugate entire worlds to their own purposes, probably viewed Netheril as a curiosity, a potential ally or a future adversary. Meanwhile, the Arcanists studied the Illithid psionic abilities and their unique methods for controlling reality. This exchange, while brief, most likely had a profound impact on the Netherese magical research. However, contact was cut off for one reason or another. Did the Netherese Arcanists find the Mind Flayers too dangerous to work with, or were the Illithids afraid of the Arcanists? By 1014 DR, the dangers of planar travel became increasingly evident. While the Illithid experiments yielded some useful knowledge, many expeditions to the plains resulted in disaster. The Netherese began to understand that these otherworldly realms were far more treacherous and complex than they had anticipated. The energies within these planes were often incompatible with the weave, causing magical failures, madness, and even death of entire enclaves. The costs of such exploration began to outweigh the benefits, and the High Mages decided to refocus their efforts back on Faerun, recognizing that the multiverse was not as easily conquerable as they had hoped. Though planar exploration was largely abandoned, Netheril did not cease its pursuit of knowledge. Instead, the Arcanists turned their attention to exploring the farthest reaches of Faerun, delving deep beneath the surface of the world. Sargot the Main, in the heart of Undermountain, a vast and labyrinthian underground realm that would later become the domain of the mad wizard Hallister Blackcloak. Sargot the Main was a center for arcane research, where the Netherese mages experimented with forbidden magic, seeking to harness the power of the Underdark and the ancient forces that dwelled there. Despite the incredible advancements made during this era, the Age of Discovery was also a time of growing unease. But the future of Netheril would only get more grim from here on. The Faerun claimed that some unknown force on the surface world was killing its children, and making the old and infirm die before their time. It wanted to know who upon the surface was using magic. Oliston sat and told the creature everything he knew of the Netherese culture, and how they were wasteful and decadent. The Faerun listened to every word Oliston uttered about the Netherese. Chapter 8. The Shadowed Age. In negative 696 DR, the year of great rains, one of the most infamous figures in Netheril's history was born, Karsus. From a young age, Karsus exhibited an extraordinary aptitude for magic, far exceeding that of his peers. His natural talent, ambition, and thirst for knowledge quickly set him on a path that would lead to both incredible innovation and ultimately the ruin of the empire. By negative 669 DR, Karsus had grown into one of the most powerful arcanists in Netheril. His relentless pursuit of magical mastery led him to establish the floating city of Eilinar, which became a hub of magical research and experimentation. Eilinar stood as a testament to Karsus's ambition and brilliance, where he and his followers delved into the depths of magic, including dangerous forms of heavy magic that drew directly from the raw essence of the weave. Karsus believed that magic was the ultimate force for reshaping reality, and he saw himself as the one who could unlock its potential. His experiments in Eilinar pushed the limits of arcane power, and his growing influence over the magical community led to tension with other Netherese arcanists, who feared that Karsus's ambition would have dire consequences for the Empire. Knowledge has always outweighed wisdom, and Karsus was no exception. The Shadowed Age also led to the discovery of the Faerun, a race of ancient, malevolent, psionically powerful beings that lived beneath the surface of the Anarok region. The Faerun had long remained hidden from the Netherese, but as the Empire expanded and its arcanists began delving deeper into the earth, they uncovered these creatures, bringing about a chain of disastrous events. Around 461 DR, the Faerun began casting their devastating life-draining magic that targeted the fertile lands of Low Netheril. The spells rapidly sapped the life from the land, turning it into the barren desert that would later become known as the Anarok Desert. The Netherese were ill-prepared for this new enemy, and the devastation wrought by the Faerun began to spread unchecked, forcing much of the population of Low Netheril to flee westward in search of safer lands. The floating enclaves of High Netheril were, for the most part, spared from the direct effects of the Faerun's magic, but the life-drain spells created increasing tensions between the arcanists of the enclaves and the people of Low Netheril. As the land withered beneath them, Low Netheril's cities were abandoned, and the growing divide between the magical elite in the sky and the suffering people on the ground grew ever wider. While the life-draining spells of the Faerun were turning the lands of Netheril into desert, many Netherese fled to other lands, bringing with them the culture of magecraft and a hunger to recapture the glory they had lost. The devastation caused by the Faerun led to widespread unrest across Low Netheril. The loss of fertile lands, the death of crops, and the collapse of cities led to civil upheaval. In negative 450 DR, large-scale migrations into the savage frontier began, with thousands fleeing the increasingly hostile conditions of Low Netheril. This mass exodus caused further destabilization in the Empire, as infrastructure that once supported Netheril's massive floating cities began to crumble. As the life-draining magic of the Faerun continued, several enclaves began constructing wards to protect themselves. In negative 427 DR, two of Netheril's floating cities, Loda and Tith Telendrothiel, fell from the sky as their Mythal Eras, The magical devices that kept them afloat were disrupted by the Faerun's influence. The loss of these enclaves shocked the magical elite, and in response, the remaining floating cities bolstered their defenses with wards designed to repel the Faerun's magic. However, these defenses only slowed the inevitable. As the land below turned to dust and chaos reigned in low Netheril, many of the surviving cities of high Netheril found themselves isolated, floating above a desolate wasteland. Some enclaves, such as Ilanar and Thultanthar, began preparing for even more drastic measures to ensure their survival, leading to growing internal conflicts among the magical elite. With permission from Karsus himself, Shadow published another work, this time on the demiplane of Shadow, entitled Shadows, the Palpable Cohesion of Formless Corporeality. In 553 DR, the Arcanists of Netheril made a groundbreaking discovery, the Shadow Plane, a parallel dimension that existed in conjunction with the material plane. This plane, a realm of darkness and shadow, offered a new and dangerous form of magic that the Netherese were eager to explore. The discovery of the Shadow Plane coincided with the development of shadow magic, a form of magic that drew its power not from the weave, but from the darkness of the Shadow Plane itself. Some enclaves, particularly Thultanthar, took to shadow magic with fervor. Telemont Tanthul, the ruler of Thultanthar, and his 12 sons, known as the Princes of Shade, began experimenting with shadow magic in ways that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. The inhabitants of Thultanthar became apt at manipulating shadows and illusions, and their mastery of this dark art allowed them to hide their intentions from the rest of the empire. As shadow magic spread through the enclaves, it caused deep divisions in Netheril's arcanists. Some believed that the use of shadow magic was dangerous, an affront to the balance of the weave that had governed magic since time immemorial. Others saw it as the next logical step in the evolution of magic, a source of untapped power that could be used to protect Netheril from the growing threat of the Faerun. Many great arcanists were born in Netheril, and many of them outlived their own civilization by centuries, typically by lichdom. Lulam, facing the growing instability of the empire and the constant threat of the Faeruns, made the decision to embrace lichdom, an act that would grant him eternal life and allow him to continue his magical research without the constraints of mortality. Lulam's transformation into a lich shocked many of Netheril's arcanists, but it also set a precedent. Over the following decades, several powerful arcanists followed Lulam's path, seeking immortality through undeath. These liches retreated into the shadows, often establishing hidden layers deep within the Underdark, where they could continue their work away from the growing chaos above. The rise of lichdom further contributed to the decline of Netheril's unity, as these immortal arcanists became increasingly isolated from the rest of society. Lulam himself retreated into the North Dark, a vast network of caverns beneath Faerun, where he established a powerful magical fortress. His survival, and that of other liches, ensured that some of Netheril's great minds would continue to influence the world long after the empire itself had fallen. Panic surged through Netheril as the citizens learned of Lulam's disappearance, and the archwizards that remained feared that there would be a revolt. Karsus, feeling the responsibility for Netheril's future on his shoulders, felt that it was his duty to weld the nation back together. By -350 DR, the effects of the Faerun's magic had spread to nearly every corner of Netheril. Low Netheril had been almost completely abandoned, and the once great floating cities were left isolated, floating above a desolate and dying land. As civil unrest spread and the arcanists became more desperate, The empire teetered on the edge of collapse. Chapter 9. Karsus's Folly. At the heart of Netheril's fall was the ambition of one man, Karsus, the most powerful arcanist in Netheril's history. Karsus believed that he could save his people from the destruction wrought by the threat of the Faerun by assuming control of magic itself. His solution was an audacious one. He would become a god, seizing control of the weave by forcibly taking the divine mantle of Mistral, the goddess of magic. The resulting disaster, known as Karsus's Folly, was the single most catastrophic event in Faerun's magical history. By -339 DR, Netheril was already teetering on the brink of collapse. The Faerun, ancient and malevolent, had been unleashing devastating, life-draining spells across low Netheril, slowly transforming the fertile lands into the wasteland that would become the Anarok Desert. Entire cities were being abandoned as farmland turned to dust and rivers dried up. The once thriving empire was rapidly losing its ability to sustain its people. The Enclaves of High Netheril, suspended far above the devastation, were largely protected from the direct effects of the Faerun's magic. However, the growing civil unrest in low Netheril, the collapse of agricultural production, and the rising tensions between the magical elite and the common folk created a volatile situation. Even within the floating cities, arcanists struggled to devise a way to stop the Faerun's seemingly unstoppable magic. In the midst of this turmoil, Karsus, already famed for his mastery of heavy magic, became convinced that the only way to save Netheril was to seize direct control over magic itself. Karsus, like many of his fellow arcanists, viewed magic as a tool to be mastered, and believed that the weave's limitations were holding back his true potential. He theorized that if he could replace Mistral, he could reshape the weave according to his will, protecting Netheril from both the Faerun and everything else. In a bid to enact his plan, Karsus began the creation of Karsus's Avatar, the most powerful spell ever conceived by mortals. This spell was a 12th level incantation, far beyond the normal limits of magic, that would allow Karsus to usurp the godhood of Mistral by stealing her divine power. This spell required immense resources, both in terms of magical energy and physical components, which Karsus gathered with the help of his followers in his enclave. The gathering of magical power caused disturbances across the empire, but few outside of Karsus's inner circle fully understood the scope of what he intended to do. Standing at the center of Ilanar, Karsus began to draw upon all the magical forces at his disposal, weaving a spell that would reach into the divine realms and pull the very essence of Mistral from her celestial throne. The skies above Netheril darkened, and waves of magical energy cascaded across the land as Karsus's spell built into its climax. The scale of the magic being wielded was unprecedented. It shook the very fabric of reality. For a brief, fleeting moment, Karsus succeeded. He stole the divine essence of Mistral, and he became a god. In that moment, Karsus had control over the weave. However, the instant he took control, it became clear that Karsus had made a fatal miscalculation. The weave was far more complex than even the greatest mortal arcanist could comprehend. As Mistral's essence flowed into him, Karsus's mind was overwhelmed by the sheer enormity of the task. Karsus's control over magic quickly began to unravel. Without the weave's delicate balance, entire cities that relied on magical infrastructure began to fall apart. The most devastating consequence, however, was the sudden failure of the Mythal Era, the enormous magical devices that kept Netheril's floating cities aloft. As the Mythalers lost their connection to the weave, the great cities of High Netheril, which had floated in the skies for centuries, began to plummet to the ground. The mighty enclaves of Netheril, centers of culture, magic, and innovation, were destroyed in mere moments. The people within the cities, unprepared for the sudden collapse, were killed in the thousands as they smashed into the earth below. The destruction was absolute, and the once proud empire of Netheril was reduced to rubble. Karsus, the greatest of Netheril's arcanists, challenged Mistral, the goddess of magic, to an arcane duel for supremacy. The ensuing battle nearly destroyed the weave, and caused the sky cities of the archwizards to plummet back to earth. As Karsus floundered his newfound godhood, unable to control the weave, Mistral acted quickly to prevent the complete collapse of magic across Faerun. In a selfless act, Mistral sacrificed herself in order to undo the damage that Karsus had caused. Her death broke Karsus's control over the weave, and for a brief moment, magic ceased to function altogether. This momentary void of magic was enough to halt the collapse of the weave, but it also sealed Netheril's fate. Without the magic that sustained them, the floating cities fell, and the infrastructure of Low Netheril, already ravaged by the Faeruns, collapsed. Mistral's sacrifice allowed the weave to be reformed, and she quickly reincarnated as Mystra, the new goddess of magic. However, Mistra's new weave was far more restrictive than before, preventing mortals from ever attempting to wield magic at such a grand scale again. Karsus, meanwhile, was left as a mortal once more, though drained of all his power. His body, petrified in the moment of his failure, fell into the ruins of Eilenar, where it remained as a grim monument to his hubris. His spell, Karsus's avatar, would become forbidden knowledge, a page in a book, a story told, but never made real again. Without the infusion of magic, the floating cities of Netheril fell, and Karsus was instantly slain. His bloated body petrified and toppled from the high plateau above his floating city and plummeted to the earth. As his body fell, his stony eyes, still shimmering with a last glint of godly omniscience, caught the glimpse of the cities of Netheril smashing to the ground, killing all their inhabitants. His heart broke. Greed for the power of the deities themselves caused the destruction of his home, his family, his friends, and his people. Chapter 10: The Diaspora and Legacy of Netheril. The collapse of Netheril in negative 339 DR sent shockwaves across Faerun, both literally and figuratively. In the wake of Karsus's folly, the once mighty empire was reduced to ruin. Its floating cities crashed to the ground, and its people scattered across the realms. Yet even in the empire's death throes, the magic, knowledge, and legacy of Netheril endured. The diaspora, the scattering of the Netherese people, spread their influence far and wide, and the remnants of their great enclaves became the subject of legend, exploration, and in some cases, resurgence. The survivors of the fall of Netheril, both from the floating enclaves in Low Netheril, were forced to flee as their world crumbled around them. The magical infrastructure that had sustained their civilization was gone, and the once fertile lands of Low Netheril were all but transformed into the Anarok Desert, thanks to the continuing life-draining magic of the Faerums. Many of the Netherese survivors fled westward to the savage frontier, where they integrated with local human and barbarian tribes. Some of these refugees carried with them fragments of their magical knowledge, which influenced the development of new settlements. One of the most notable cities founded by Nether Age survivors was Ilusk, later Luskan, which became a powerful city-state in the north and a hub of magical activity for centuries to come. Some Nether Age settlers had already ventured south before the Empire's fall. These refugees eventually founded the Kingdom of Halrua, a land of magic that was deeply influenced by Netheril's traditions. Halrua became known for its powerful magic, though its rulers learned from the mistakes of their Nether Age ancestors. Unlike Netheril, Halrua maintained tight control over the use of powerful magic, avoiding the hubris that had once destroyed the original empire. In the east, the survivors of Low Netheril who remained in the Anarok Desert became the Bedain, nomadic tribes that adapted to the harsh, desolate environment. Though much of their magical heritage was lost, the Bedain preserved fragments of their ancestors' culture and history through oral tradition. Their lives in the desert were a stark contrast to the grandeur of the floating cities, but the Bedain carried with them the legacy of a fallen empire. Those who followed the northern mountain passes were welcomed by the shield dwarves of Citadel Sunbar and the fair folk of Erlon. In time, the elven city of Askelhorn was given over to the Nether Age refugees, on the condition that they would help defend Erlon and forswear the use of their forebears' most dangerous arcane practices. The fall of Low Netheril was much more gradual. The Nether Age slowly abandoned the heartlands of the realm and spread west, south, and east into the border areas that were once wilderness. Though the physical empire of Netheril was destroyed, its legacy endured in many ways. The magic, culture, and knowledge of the Nether Age were scattered across Faerun, influencing the development of future civilizations and magical traditions. The Nether Scrolls, ancient repositories of arcane knowledge, remained one of the most coveted treasures in the world, sought by arcanists, treasure hunters, and scholars eager to unlock the secrets of the Weave. The survivors of Netheril spread their culture and magic wherever they settled. These remnants of Netheril's legacy would continue to influence the course of history, shaping the future of magic and power in Faerun. The vast Anarok Desert, once the heartland of the Nether Age Empire, became a lasting monument to the Empire's fall. The desert covered the ruins of Low Netheril, and scattered remains of its floating cities lay buried beneath the shifting sands. While much of Netheril's magic was lost in the collapse, its influence continued to ripple through history. The rise and fall of Netheril became a cautionary tale for wizards, a reminder of the dangers of overreaching ambition and the catastrophic consequences of unchecked power.